The unbelievable has happened. A metastasis has risen up against the cancerous tumor. In Abkhazia, a large and determined crowd protesting against the pro-Russian pseudo-government stormed the parliament building. The man who calls himself the president of the unrecognized state, Aslan Bzhanya, fled his office, grabbing wooden spoons and a kokoshnik, and hid at a Russian military base. Where else would he go?
The negotiation process has stopped because the president ran away, and we can't find the people who could tell us where and in which direction. But according to our information, there is a high probability that he is in the Russian part of Bangora.
Yes, yes, dear Georgians who voted for the pro-Russian party Georgian Dream. There is a Russian military base in your territory. Just so you don't forget.
The commander-in-chief of the Republic's army, Aslan Bzhanya, arrived at the Sable training ground by Abkhazian Air Force helicopter to take part in joint tactical exercises involving servicemen from the Ministry of Defense of Abkhazia, the Russian military base, and other security agencies.
Russia is a kind of persistent herpes or stubborn, relentless scabies. It infects, contaminates, and taints everything it can possibly reach with an itch, and then covers it in festering, oozing sores. Long before Moscow laid its larvae in Donbass and Crimea, it carefully rehearsed its crimes in Georgia, perfecting its methods. The occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia followed the same script as in the so-called LPR and DPR. Russia supplied the Abkhaz separatists with weapons and so-called militiamen who crossed the border en masse without any identifying insignia.
A volunteer from Chechnya, Nurigin Aliyev, a recipient of the Order of the Lion, spent a month and a week in Georgian captivity. The only question he does not want to answer is about his memories of that period of his military life. He came to Abkhazia and saw an address by Vladislav Ardzinba. Before that, the fighter knew nothing about our country. More than 2,300 volunteers participated in the patriotic war of the people of Abkhazia. During the war, more than 260 volunteers were killed.
Just so you understand, the First Minister of Defense of Abkhazia was a Russian citizen. We've seen something like this before.
If our unit hadn't come to Donbass and become the core of the resistance, the core of the so-called Russian Spring in Donbass, then most likely, without this core, the Russian Spring would have been crushed all the way up to the border.
Russia took advantage of internal contradictions in Georgia and, following the old Russian tradition, poured gasoline and gunpowder on the situation. As a result of the fighting, 200,000 Georgians were forced to leave Abkhazia because the admirers of traditional values slaughtered them by entire families. In the end, Abkhazia came under the complete control of Moscow. They put an organized crime group in charge and began building the Russian world.
From the moment the CIS peacekeeping forces were established, Russia began to celebrate the Day of Russian Peacekeeping Forces. Russian peacekeepers have come a remarkable way, creating conditions for maintaining lasting peace, and in doing so have earned great respect and goodwill from the local population.
Wherever the Russian world arrives, hot water, jobs, healthcare, investment, and common sense immediately disappear. Everyone knows what Russia has turned Donbass into over the past 10 years, the most rapidly developing region of Ukraine. Only 2 years passed from Euro 2012 to the Makeyevka Spring. The DPR and LPR have become symbols of destitution and degradation.
A payphone built with the latest modern and advanced technology was installed in the center of Donetsk. The device is noticeably and substantially different from its predecessors in every respect.
And now, imagine what heights the Russian world has reached in Abkhazia over 30 years. Spoiler, fantastic ones.
Son, this is fantastic.
Abkhazia used to be an elite all-union resort, a kind of Caucasian Riviera. Going on vacation to Abkhazia was every Soviet person's dream.
You can't imagine, I'm about to fly to Galgra.
Palm trees, the sea, beautiful architecture. It was as if NATO had dropped a piece of Italy onto the Soviet Union from a plane. And all the while, Abkhazia's golden age coincided with its time as part of Georgia. Despite all the contradictions and conflicts, Abkhazia was developing. But then the Russian world knocked on the door, and the people fogged up from the booze breath. 30 years, a flourishing region has turned into the set of the TV series The Walking Dead. The palm trees have withered, the architecture has crumbled, and the streams of tourists have dwindled to just a handful of stalkers and thrill-seekers. Comparing the resorts of Abkhazia to Georgia's Batumi feels almost truly improper, even cruel. The Russian world has drained and gutted Abkhazia, turning it into a kind of Somalia, where the only decent way to make a living is by becoming a mercenary in the Russian army. Abkhaz militants have gone en masse to fight in Donbass. Do you think it's because they have some personal vendetta against Bandera? No, it's just that they've already looted and killed everyone back home.
Everything will be just the way we like.
In Donbass, the skills honed during the endless Georgian war came in handy, and it turned out that hating Ukrainians is actually a pretty good business. And the only export of this unrecognized entity...
The International Brigade Pyatnashka. Its commander is the hero of the DNR Akravitsba, call sign Abkhaz. Pyatnashka already has its own unique history, its own hopes, its own losses, its own victories. From the very first days of the Russian military special operation, Pyatnashka has been on the front lines. Volunteers continue to join its ranks, many of whom are from Abkhazia.
As of today, I am still leading wars, just as I have done countless times before throughout my life. Nothing about this is new to me. It's all very familiar, something I have experienced many times. The main thing remains unchanged.
While Abkhazians were dying for Putin in conflicts all over the world, the henchmen of the pale master manipulator were packing up the Republic's riches into suitcases and taking them across the border. And when there was nothing left to take out, they decided to seize the last thing the Abkhazians had, their land and their homes. Since 2008, Moscow has been pushing for the adoption of the so-called apartment law, which would allow Russians to build apartment complexes, buy up real estate, and purchase land in occupied Abkhazia. In addition, Russian so-called investors receive years-long tax holidays and duty-free import of construction materials. Fair competition with the locals is absolutely non-existent.
We must not give away our land, began Akravitsba, commander of the International Volunteer Brigade Pyatnashka, referring to the issue of ratifying the agreement on the alienation of the Pitsonda state Dacha territories. As the DPR hero recounts, he learned about the Pitsonda issue while he was in Donetsk.
We send a warm, very warm greeting to the acting president of the Republic of Abkhazia. They won't let me lead the Donetsk People's Republic, even though I am not a citizen of the Donetsk People's Republic. This is a violation of all laws and all norms. Let me just say, I will make it to Abkhazia anyway. You shouldn't be acting this way, and it seems you're already afraid and not without reason.
And at this point, the Abkhazians finally caught on. They realized what Moscow's plan was, to bankrupt the region and then buy it up for the price of a box of matches. And then to bring in masses of Russians onto the land seized for next to nothing. For sparsely populated Abkhazia, this is a demographic catastrophe. On top of that, it's a death sentence for the local tourism industry, because the nearly destitute Abkhaz resorts won't be able to compete with Moscow corporations.
Tourism, the way we're used to catching people on the street, talking their ears off, and then taking them somewhere well, there's none of that anymore either. Because now everything is provided only internally, within the system. They live separately, they do all their shopping separately, our markets, everything will collapse, we'll be left on our own. Basically, it's as if we have tourists and don't have them at the same time. And as for saying they'll pay taxes, let's look at our legislation. How much investment do you need to be tax exempt?
The Abkhaz people began to protest, and the law was withdrawn. But only temporarily. The Kremlin quickly forgot about the brotherly relations and made life in Abkhazia even more unbearable so that it would become more compliant. The Abkhaz-Russian conflict escalated in the fall of this year when Moscow stopped funding the unrecognized republic. Doctors, teachers, and law enforcement officers were left without money.
They have already started to be implemented. In fact, since September onwards, as you probably already know, social funding has officially been restored, meaning that funding for doctors, teachers, law enforcement agencies, and many others has resumed. This important step ensures continued support for these essential professionals.
Russia has literally issued an ultimatum. Either you pass the laws we need and give up your land, every last bit of it, or we will starve your doctors and teachers. How do you say that in Russian?
Kiss my A, just seriously.
The tension between Moscow and the colony kept rising, fueled by the endless stream of coffins and wounded, returning from Ukraine as if off an assembly line. So now, when the Kremlin once again tried to push through a law on apartments in the unrecognized parliament of the unrecognized republic, the population of Abkhazia erupted. They stormed the parliament and other government institutions and are now unequivocally demanding, in no uncertain terms and with great determination and unity, that the Russian Gorlight Abkhazia without delay follow the Russian warship. In fact, this is an uprising against the Russian occupation. However, the protesters are very careful to state that this is not the case, and that Moscow is still their friend, ally, and partner. As usual, the officials are bad, but the Tsar is D'Artagnan.
They claim that a coup d'etat has taken place in Abkhazia, that some pro-Western, pro-Turkish forces are seizing power and striving for control. They are trying to push this kind of narrative. You see, spread it around. We are officially stating here that there are no anti-Russian forces here. This is the will of the people who have not been heard.
And this is actually the main misconception among the Abkhaz people, primarily because there is simply no real functioning local authority in the so-called unrecognized republic. They are simply executors of Kremlin orders. It is Moscow that is deliberately destroying the region. And it is Moscow that wants to, without hesitation, take away the Abkhaz people's homes and properties, businesses, and even their people, who, faced with total poverty and unemployment, will be forced to sign contracts with the orcs and end up as fertilizer in Donbass, just so that Donbass remains the same black hole as the Abkhaz ghetto forever.
Is that sad or funny? This is sad.
The Abkhaz people must see their determined uprising through to its logical and inevitable conclusion and resolutely force the Russians out of their land, restore positive and constructive relations with their neighbors, and ultimately return to the fold of the civilized world. Then the palm trees will bloom again, and the tourists will return. Obviously, 30 years of total hell is enough to understand that.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.